Alright, this video provides an in-depth analysis of two commonly occurring endgames, Rook and Knight versus Rook and Rook and Bishop versus Rook. After watching this video, you should be able to completely understand the logic and reasoning behind even the deepest positions of these endgames. So, this video is not so much about memorizing moves and variations, but rather developing a simple system of terminologies to give recognition to the most significant formations. I've invented my own terminologies to describe the recurring formations as well as use some pre-existing terminologies. Before I go on to explain the concepts of these endgames, first I'll explain the answers to some of the most common questions regarding these endgames. So, first question, are these endgames usually draws, or is the extra minor piece enough to win? And the answer is that both of these endgames are draws in general, because with no pawns on the board, there isn't much for the winning side to play for. A single minor piece isn't sufficient mating material, so trading rooks is simply going to lead to a dead draw. The attacker can only win by checkmating with the given material, or by capturing the defender's rook without losing own rook and without stalemating the defender's king. So, checkmating with the given material can usually only happen on an edge or in a corner, but if the defender's rook is obstructing a square from its king, then it's possible to checkmate away from the corner, but it can't really be forced unless the defender willingly obstructs their own king, or the defender's king is at least near the edge or corner where it has limited options. This is another example which also involves a forking theme. So instead of mating with the given material, there are also tactics to win the defender's rook like forks, pins, skewers, discovered attacks, etc. But the defender can usually avoid losing to simple tactics unless the defender's king is on an edge or corner, in which the tactics can be employed in conjunction with checkmating tactics. So in this example, black can't immediately capture the rook because that would be a stalemate, but white's rook on f2 is subject to a fork. After rook h1 check, king b2, black has the fork, knight to d1 check. In this example, the c1 square is indirectly restricted by the idea of a bishop fork, so black wins with king to b3, threatening checkmate on the first rank, which prevents white from capturing the bishop, and if white's king tries escaping toward the center, then black has the fork. White's only move would be rook to g1, defending the first rank, but that leaves the rook to where it's subject to a skewer after rook to a2, threatening rook to a1 checkmate, which is supported by the bishop. White's only move would be king to c1, which avoids the checkmate, but it's still losing to the skewer along the first rank. Alright, in this example, black wins with king to b3, revealing the bishop's diagonal to control a1, so black is threatening rook to a1 mate, and black is also making room for the bishop to block on c3 if white plays rook to f3 check. The bishop can block on c3 and simultaneously control d2 in case white's king tries to escape toward the center. And instead of rook to f3 check, if white immediately tries escaping toward the center, then the c1 square is indirectly restricted by a discovered attack. So the safe square for black to check on would be b2. So if white's king moves toward the center, black wins the rook and there's no stalemate. But if king to b1, then black simply checkmates, since taking the rook would lead to stalemate. Alright, in this example, black wins with knight to c3 check, and the c1 square is indirectly restricted by the knight fork, and if king to c2, then white's king is getting forced to c1 anyway, and any other king move is either going to get checkmated or white's king is getting forced to c1, so there's pretty much nothing that white can do in this position. So rook and minor piece versus rook is generally a draw, but in the examples we saw, the attacker had tactics to exploit the flaws in the defender's position. Normally it's impossible to force a scenario where the enemy monarch is restricted to a wall, but it's different in queen versus rook because the queen has thematic forking tactics in which the locations of the defender's pieces don't matter much. The queen pretty much always has a checking move and can't be attacked by the defender's king, and the queen can check like a rook while attacking the enemy rook from diagonally. So the queen generally has more tactical power than the concentrated power of a rook and minor piece. Queen versus rook is generally a win, even when the defender's king is in the center, but rook and minor piece versus rook is usually a draw, because the rook and minor piece won't always have a checking move, and they have less potential for double attacks. So that pretty much answers our question. Rook and minor piece versus rook is generally a draw if the defender's king is away from the edge and there aren't any immediate tactics, but long-term winning chances exist if the defender's king is trapped near an edge or corner. So that brings us to our next question: what is the most number of moves that it can possibly take to force a win? There are two main ways to measure the number of moves required to win: the distance to mate or DTM metric, or the distance to conversion DTC metric. The DTM metric measures the total number of moves required to force checkmate, regardless of any change in the material count, while the DTC metric will treat a conversion into a resignable endgame as the equivalent of a checkmate. The problem with the DTM metric is that sometimes the defender's best move will be to sacrifice the rook in order to increase the depth of the winning process, so using the DTC metric is more logical for these endgames because the king and rook versus king endgame is very elementary. The defender's rook should try to stay on the board as long as possible. So out of all possible arrangements, the rook and knight versus rook, the deepest possible forced win is 33 moves if you go by the more logical DTC metric. Otherwise, it's 37 moves going by the DTM metric. And out of all possible arrangements of rook and bishop versus rook, the deepest possible forced win is 59 moves DTC or 65 moves DTM. So I used a DTC table base to examine the winning sequences of these endgames, and I'll get into the more concrete analysis later, but for now, let's just kind of look at an overview of these sequences.